Your vulnerability is not an error. It is your sentence. Look around you. It seems to you that you are surrounded by civilization, laws, and morality. This is a lie. You are located in an artificially constructed pen where predators have simply learned to wear Brioni suits and smile, baring bleached teeth instead of fangs. Your problem is not that you are weak. Your problem is that you are naive. You believe in justice, in fair play, and in the idea that if you work hard, the world will reward you. This is a cognitive error that makes you an ideal food source. While you seek approval, others seek levers of pressure. While you reflect on your feelings, they analyze your vulnerabilities. This text is not motivation. It is a deconstruction of your slave mentality. We shall dissect your psyche, excise the tumor of hope from it, and replace it with cold calculation. If you are ready to admit that you are currently the prey, you have a chance to become the hunter. If not, close this and continue waiting to be eaten. Chapter 1. The Art of the Informational Vacuum Phase. The Encounter. The boardroom of Argus Holding smelled of cold ozone and stagnant fear. Alexei sat opposite Victor, his mentor, the man who had taught him to build business on trust for 3 years. Before them lay the merger report that Alexei had been preparing for 8 months. Alexei. Victor's voice was soft, almost paternal. He did not look at the papers. He looked into Alexei's eyes, slowly rubbing a gold pinky ring with the pad of his thumb. The board of directors has reviewed your proposal. We have decided to hand this case over to Mark. He has more experience in delicate matters. Mark, who sat to the right of Victor, did not even smile. He simply waited for exactly 4 seconds. In this silence, the hum of the air conditioner could be heard, driving a monotonous rhythm into Alexei's temples. Mark slowly moved his gaze to the bridge of Alexei's nose, not into the eyes, to the point between the eyebrows. This technique causes the opponent a subconscious sense of threat and discomfort. Any questions? Mark threw out. His voice was dry, like the crack of a breaking bone. Alexei felt heat rising to his throat. His brain feverishly searched for arguments. But this is my work. I conducted all the negotiations. This is unfair. These phrases swarmed in his head, ready to burst out in a shameful stream of excuses. He opened his mouth to begin defending himself, but encountered the icy, evaluating gaze of Victor. Phase: Psychological X-ray. What is happening at this moment? Alexei is in a state of cognitive suppression. His limbic system has recorded an act of aggression, theft of intellectual property. But social constructs, respect for elders, corporate ethics, block the fight response. As a result, the adrenal glands release cortisol, causing a freeze state. Victor and Mark use triangulation. They have united against him, creating the illusion of an objective majority opinion. Mark uses the technique of visual dominance by looking at the bridge of the nose, which destabilizes Alexei's prefrontal cortex, responsible for logical thinking. The main mistake Alexei makes in this second is the desire to fill the silence. In social hierarchy, the one who talks more, making excuses, automatically occupies a subordinate position. Silence, however, is the territory of power. Phase: Counterstrike. Alexei closed his mouth. He felt his heart pounding against his ribs, but he forced his facial muscles to relax. Instead of starting an argument, he slowly leaned back in his chair. This movement, increasing the distance, showed that he was not afraid of an attack. He remained silent. 10 seconds. 15. Mark began to tap his pen on the table almost imperceptibly. His dopamine loop of victory expectation failed. He needed Alexei's reaction, anger, resentment, a plea, to consolidate his superiority. The vacuum of information began to frighten him. "That is an interesting decision," Alexei finally said, lowering the timbre of his voice. A low voice is subconsciously perceived as a sign of high testosterone and confidence. "I assume Mark is already familiar with Protocol B regarding tax risks in the offshore zone?" He knew that no Protocol B existed, but he had created an informational trap. Lesson number 1. Silence is a tool for the projection of fear. Whoever is the first to break the silence after a blow admits defeat. Use the vacuum to make the enemy doubt their own superiority. Phase: sensory immersion. Outside the window, the sky over the metropolis was the color of dirty aluminum. The office glass cut off all sounds of the living world, leaving only the sterile noise of machinery. This office was designed so that a person would feel like a cog in a huge, soulless mechanism. Alexei looked at his reflection in the polished surface of the table. Distorted, dark, and foreign. He realized that in this forest of concrete and glass, it is not the most righteous who survives, but the one who knows how to lurk in the shadows. Chapter 2. The jurisdiction of conscience and the poison of excuses. Phase: the encounter. That same evening, Victor summoned Alexei to his office. The office was flooded with the soft light of expensive lamps. It smelled of good tobacco and old paper. This was an atmosphere of safety created to lull the victim's vigilance. "Alyosha." Victor stepped out from behind the desk, violating Alexei's personal space, and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You surely understand, this is not personal. Business requires sacrifices. I want you not to hold a grudge. We are family, are we not?" "Explain to me. What was that question about Protocol B? You're not planning to put a spoke in our wheels, are you?" Victor used the halo effect, his reputation as the founding father, and gaslighting, trying to make Alexei feel guilt for his legitimate defensive reaction. He waited for explanations. He expected Alexei to start saying, "No, of course not. I just wanted to clarify." Alexei felt the weight of Victor's hand. It was not support. It was a grip. Victor's fingers slightly squeezed the trapezius muscle, sending a signal of dominance directly into Alexei's brainstem. Phase: psychological X-ray. Here we see a classic attempt to restore control through empathy. Victor uses the diminutive Alyosha to regress the psyche of an adult man into a childlike state. Why do we make excuses? This is a biological mechanism. In a tribe, exile meant death. An excuse is an attempt to convince the leader that you are still one of them and useful. But in a modern corporate or social war, an excuse is a recognition of someone else's jurisdiction over your conscience. As soon as you begin to explain your actions, you admit that the other person has the right to judge you. Phase: counterstrike. Alexei moved softly but resolutely to the side, forcing Victor's hand to slip off. He did not smile back. "Victor," he said, looking directly into his eyes and holding contact slightly longer than is comfortable, about 3.5 seconds. "My actions do not require explanations as long as they bring results to the company. As for Mark, if he is an expert, he will figure everything out himself." He neither confirmed nor denied the existence of the protocol. He left Victor in a state of cognitive dissonance. "You have changed." Victor squinted. A hint of steel appeared in his voice. "I have simply stopped confusing strategy with charity," Alexei replied. Lesson number 2. Never make excuses. An excuse is a recognition of your weakness. If your actions have prompted a question, answer with a question or a statement of fact. Your motives are your private property. Phase: sensory immersion. Alexei exited the building. A fine, stinging rain was falling outside. Drops shattered against the asphalt like the hopes of those who believe in honesty. The city glowed with millions of lights, but each of those lights burned at the expense of someone else's resources. Alexei took a deep breath of the moist air. He no longer felt like part of the crowd rushing to the subway. He felt like an observer studying the architecture of the trap he would no longer fall into. Chapter 3. False vulnerability, the wounded beast tactic. Phase: the encounter. A week later, it became clear. Mark was failing the deal. Without Alexei's actual knowledge, he could not connect the logistical chains. Alexei saw this by the twitching of Mark's eyelid at morning meetings and by how Mark began to drink coffee more often, trying to stimulate an exhausted dopamine system. Alexei decided to strike. He entered Mark's office when Mark was at the peak of stress. But he did not enter as a victor. Alexei looked tired. His tie was slightly loosened, his shoulders were slumped. He sat on a chair, folding his hands on his knees in a closed pose, demonstrating insecurity. "Mark, I think I made a mistake," Alexei whispered, looking at the floor. "Victor is angry with me. I am afraid that I will lose my bonuses. Listen, I have the files on Argus that I did not have time to hand over. Everything's there. Shadow accounts, personal contacts of suppliers. I will give them to you if you promise to put in a good word for me with the boss." Mark's pupils dilated. This was a rush of adrenaline. He saw a weak enemy who had crawled back to surrender. His overconfidence effect clouded his judgment. He did not notice that Alexei was sitting in a way that allowed him to see the reflection of Mark's monitor in the glass door of the cabinet. Phase: psychological X-ray. Alexei uses the technique of false vulnerability. In ethology, a predator often pretends to be wounded to lure the prey into an area where it is easier to attack. Mark fell victim to script thinking. He expected Alexei to seek revenge, and when Alexei came to ask for help, Mark's brain chose the easiest and most pleasant path, believing in his final victory. At this moment, critical thinking shuts down. Mark stopped analyzing risks because his ego received a powerful boost. Phase: counterstrike. "Fine," Mark threw out condescendingly, barely containing his triumph. "Leave the flash drive on the table. I will see what can be done for you, buddy." Alexei placed the flash drive down. There were indeed files on it. But in every document, a macro was embedded that, upon opening, recorded the time IP address and the fact of unauthorized access to confidential data that Mark officially had no right to view without the signature of the security service. As soon as Mark opened the first file, he signed his own sentence. Now Alexei had compromising evidence of a direct violation of the corporate charter. Lesson number 3. Your weakness should be your most effective weapon. Provoke the enemy into aggression by offering your throat, which is actually a steel trap. People see what they want to see. Phase: sensory immersion. Mark's office smelled of expensive perfume, which could not hide the scent of sweat and fear. The light from the monitor fell on Mark's face, making it look like a wax mask. Alexei went out into the corridor, and the silence of the office seemed like a symphony to him. He walked along the carpet runner, which absorbed the sounds of his steps. A predator always moves silently. Chapter 4. Radical pragmatism, the death of moral duty. Phase. The encounter. The light in the meeting room was too bright, surgical. Elena, the only person Alexei could have called an ally, sat to his right. Her fingers trembled as she shuffled the report pages. She had made a technical error in the logistics calculations, and now Victor, like a vulture, circled over this oversight. How could this happen, Lenotchka? Victor sighed falsely, looking at her with feigned sadness. We entrusted you with the core of the project, and you let Alexei down. You let us all down. Elena cast a quick, pleading glance at Alexei. In it, hope for protection was visible. They had worked on this project together through the nights. He knew that the error was caused by exhaustion, for which Victor himself was responsible, having buried her under secondary tasks. Alexei felt an old instinct stirring inside him. Justice. He wanted to stand up and say, "This is my fault too. I did not check." He looked at Victor. Victor was waiting. This was a classic quality test. If Alexei protected Elena, he would share her failure and become vulnerable to the next blow. If he remained silent, he would lose Elena's loyalty. Alexei waited for a pause. In his head, hundreds of scenarios flashed by in a fraction of a second. He analyzed Victor's micro-expressions. The corner of his lip was slightly raised. It was the grin of a winner who had already prepared the second noose. Elena. Alexei's voice was devoid of warmth. It was flat like the line on a corpse's heart rate monitor. You did indeed make a critical error. I trusted your professionalism, and that was my oversight. Elena froze. Her eyes widened and her pupils narrowed, a reaction to betrayal. She felt as if an icy wall had physically grown between them. Victor is right, Alexei continued, not looking at her. In strategic matters, there is no place for effort. There is only the result. I propose to remove Elena from operational management, then hand the audit of her sector over to an external contractor. I shall personally select the company. Victor was momentarily taken aback. He had expected protection, had expected an emotional dispute in which he would have crushed Alexei. But Alexei had finished off his own ally himself, depriving Victor of the pleasure of doing it publicly. Phase, psychological X-ray. What happened? Alexei committed an act of radical pragmatism. He recognized the empathy trap. Biologically, we are programmed to protect our own. This is a legacy of tribal survival. However, in modern hierarchies, this instinct is often used against you. At this moment, Elena is a toxic asset. Her error became a lever for Victor. By trying to save her, Alexei would have committed the sunk cost fallacy. I have invested a lot of time in this person. Therefore, I must save her even to my own detriment. Alexei applied cognitive dissociation. He separated his personal attitude toward Elena from the strategic goal. His decision to remove her is not a betrayal in his understanding. It is the sanitary treatment of the project. Furthermore, by proposing an external auditor, he intercepted the initiative from Victor, not allowing him to put his own person in charge of the inspection. On the level of neurochemistry, Alexei's brain blocked the release of oxytocin, the attachment hormone, and switched to prefrontal control. He realized that Elena was the weak link, and if he did not get rid of it himself, he would be dragged to the bottom along with her. Phase, counterstrike. After the meeting, Elena caught up with him in the corridor. Her face was pale. There were tears in her eyes. How could you? She hissed. I was on your side. Alexei stopped, but he did not turn his whole body toward her, maintaining a position of closed interest. You were on my side as long as you were useful. He cut her off. Now you are a burden. If you want to survive in this structure, stop crying and start thinking about how to fix the numbers. If the audit I appointed finds a way to write off these losses as a technical system failure, you will have a chance to return. No, not as my friend, but as a tool that has been repaired. He left her standing in the cold corridor. He knew that now she would work 10 times harder to prove her value, and she would fear him more than Victor. Fear is more reliable than loyalty. Lesson number 4. Friendship and loyalty in a conflict zone are an emotional tax you pay for your weakness. Evaluate people as assets. If an asset brings a loss, fix the losses and exit the deal without regret. Phase: sensory immersion. The office smelled of ozone and expensive carpet cleaner, a chemical, dead smell. Alexei walked toward his office, and the sound of his steps on the tile reminded him of the clicks of a shutter. Reflections in the panoramic windows shattered, turning people into blurry shadows. The world became perfectly clear, devoid of the colors of sympathy. He felt like a surgeon who had just severed a gangrenous limb. There was a little blood, but the patient, his career, now had a chance of survival. Chapter 5. Destruction of reality. The psychology of paranoia phase. The encounter. Victor began to lose his grip. Alexei noticed this in the small details. Victor started to linger longer at lunches. His hands sometimes trembled when he flipped through reports. It was time to move to destabilization. Alexei began dropping information. He did not lie directly, he created context. At the morning briefing, Alexei did not sit in his usual place, but slightly closer to Victor, violating his comfort zone. In the middle of Victor's speech, Alexei suddenly frowned, looked at his phone, and then looked up at Victor with an expression of pity. Very briefly, for 2 seconds. And then he looked back at the screen. Victor faltered. "Alexei, is there any news on the market?" he asked, trying to regain control. "Nothing special, Victor Sergeyevich." Alexei smiled with the corners of his eyes, but the eyes themselves remained cold. "Just a curious coincidence in the charts. Do not worry about it. Please continue. This concerns only the security department." He intentionally used the word security. Victor had his own skeletons, and the mere mention of that department made his brain launch the process of searching for threats. For the rest of the day, Alexei acted according to the invisible pressure protocol. He passed Victor's office while talking on the phone, uttering only fragments of phrases. "Yes, exactly that account. No, not arrested yet. Waiting for confirmation from the auditors." Phase: psychological X-ray. Alexei is applying the technique of paranoia induction. The human brain is a machine for finding patterns. If you give it 2 or 3 scattered but alarming facts, it will complete the picture of a catastrophe itself. This is called apophenia. Victor suffers from confirmation bias. Now he will look for evidence in Alexei's every action that a conspiracy is being prepared against him. This sharply raises the level of cortisol in his blood. Prolonged exposure to cortisol suppresses the function of the hippocampus, which leads to impaired memory and an inability to make complex strategic decisions. Alexei uses gaslighting of reality. He does not deny the facts, he changes their significance. Nothing special combined with an anxious appearance is the most powerful stimulus for the development of internal anxiety in an opponent. Phase: Counter-strike. By evening, Victor summoned Alexei himself. He looked aged. "Alexei, come in. What are those accounts? What is that inspection?" Victor tried to sound authoritative, but at the end of the phrase, his voice cracked. Alexei entered and softly closed the door. He did not sit. He stood, looming over Victor's desk, using his physical advantage. "Victor Sergeyevich, you are too nervous. This is bad for your heart. What accounts?" "I was talking about our cleaning contractors. They have some tax problems." "And what were you thinking about?" Alexei waited for a pause, watching the vein pulse on Victor's temple. "Or is there something I should know about, so that I can protect you if a real audit suddenly arrives?" This was a masterful move. Alexei offered protection while simultaneously confirming that the threat was real. He turned from a subordinate into a savior who knows a secret. Lesson number 5. Control the informational background of the enemy. Sow a seed of doubt, and their own imagination will do all the dirty work for you. A paranoid person destroys himself from within. Phase. Sensory immersion. Victor's office was stuffy. It smelled of stale cognac and old leather chairs. The massive oak desk, which had previously seemed like a symbol of power, now looked like a tombstone. Outside the window, twilight was gathering, and the city lights seemed to Alexei like the eyes of predators lurking in the jungle. He felt power flowing from Victor's hands into his own, invisible, heavy, and cold as mercury. Chapter 6. Effect of presence through absence, scarcity as power phase. The encounter. The merger project reached a critical point. Everyone was waiting for Alexei's final signature on the strategic plan. At that exact moment, he turned off his phone and left. He did not warn anyone. He simply did not show up for the key meeting where the shareholders were present. In his absence, chaos began in the office. Mark tried to take over management, but it quickly became clear that Alexei had centralized all key contacts on himself. No one knew the passwords for the encrypted databases. No one had a direct line to the Asian partners. Victor was fuming, but behind his rage lay animal fear. He realized that Alexei was not just an employee. He was the load-bearing structure. Without him, the entire building of Argus would begin to collapse inward. Alexei, meanwhile, was sitting on the terrace of a country house 100 kilometers from the city. He was not resting. He was analyzing the system access logs that came to his secure tablet. He saw Mark unsuccessfully trying to hack his email. He saw the shareholders calling his number incessantly. Phase. Psychological X-ray. Alexei uses the law of resource scarcity. In social psychology, the value of an object increases when it becomes unavailable. As long as Alexei was in the office 24/7, he was taken for granted. His efficiency was background noise. By disappearing at the most critical moment, he provoked a loss of control syndrome in those around him. People tend to overestimate the significance of what they have lost. Biologically, this is a reaction to the disappearance of a provider or protector in a group. The group falls into a state of panic, which makes its members extremely suggestible. When Alexei returns, his conditions will be accepted without discussion because the price of his presence now seems infinite to the shareholders. Phase. Counter-strike. Alexei returned 3 days later. He entered the office in the middle of another crisis meeting. He looked fresh and rested in a perfectly ironed shirt. The silence that fell over the room was almost physically palpable. "Where have you been?" Victor shouted, jumping up from his seat. His tie was crooked. Dark shadows lay under his eyes. Alexei slowly placed his tablet on the table. "I was analyzing risks," he replied calmly. "And I came to the conclusion that with the current composition of management, the project is doomed. I have prepared a new charter for the department. Either we sign it now and I fix the situation within 48 hours, or I return to my vacation and you explain to the shareholders why the deal has failed." Mark tried to interject something, but one of the main shareholders, a solid older man, simply stopped him with a gesture. "Shut up, Mark. Alexei, give us the papers." Lesson number 6. Your indispensability is not about how much you work, but about how much it hurts those around you when you are not there. Create dependency, and then demonstrate scarcity. Phase: sensory immersion. The country air was clean and merciless. The silence of the forest emphasized the bustle of the city that Alexei had left behind. Returning to the office, he felt the contrast acutely. It smelled of burning from overheated servers and cheap adrenaline. He looked at the faces of his colleagues. They were like pale deep-sea fish washed ashore. He was their oxygen, and now he was going to sell that oxygen at the highest price. Chapter 7. The biology of dominance, the body as an interface of strength phase. The encounter. Before the final fight for the seat of the chairman of the board of directors, Alexei stood in the restroom in front of the mirror. He was not fixing his hair. He was observing his body. His hands reached out to adjust his tie knot, a gesture of self-correction, a sign of insecurity. He forced them to drop. In 5 minutes, he was to enter the hall where Victor, who had regained some influence, and the shareholders, ready for a reckoning, were waiting for him. Alexei felt a cold knot tightening in his stomach. This was adrenaline, an ancient reaction to the proximity of an enemy. But if he allowed it to flow uncontrollably through his veins, his voice would become higher, and his movements would become restless. He squared his shoulders, stood with his feet wide apart, and leaned his hands on the edge of the sink. He occupied as much space as possible. He looked into his pupils until he felt the panic replaced by heavy, icy calm. When he entered the hall, he did not sit down immediately. He walked along the table, touching the backs of the shareholders' chairs with his fingers, violating their personal space, marking his territory. Mark tried to say something, but Alexei did not deign even to turn his head. He walked slowly, 0.5 meters per second. Speed is the privilege of the one who has nowhere to run and no one to fear. Phase: psychological X-ray. Alexei uses the principle of postural dominance. In ethology, high-ranking individuals always occupy more physical space. When you shrink, your brain receives the signal, "I am a victim." When you expand, feedback is triggered. Testosterone levels rise, and cortisol, the stress hormone, levels fall. His slow walk is a demonstration of control over time. Low-ranking individuals bustle about, trying to please or to finish an unpleasant contact faster. The dominant individual imposes their own rhythm. He touched upon the effect of presence through tactile contact with the chairs. This is a mild form of aggression that forces the opponent's brains to switch to defensive mode even before the start of verbal contact. At this moment, the prefrontal cortex of the shareholders begins to perceive Alexei as an alpha, whose words will have more weight simply because of his physical presentation. Phase: counterstrike. Victor began to speak, but Alexei interrupted him, not with a shout, but simply by starting a phrase at the same volume, but in a lower register. He did not stop when Victor tried to continue. He continued speaking, looking directly into Victor's eyes, until Victor faltered. Viktor Sergeyevich. Alexei paused for 3 seconds. Your emotionality prevents us from seeing the numbers. You are currently defending not the company, but your fear of retirement. Look at the profitability chart. Alexei did not point to the screen. He forced Viktor himself to turn toward the chart, thereby forcing him to physically submit to his command. Lesson number 7. The psyche follows the body. If you want to win, start broadcasting victory at the level of physiology. Control the pace of your speech, occupy space, and never make unnecessary, restless movements. Your stillness is more frightening than your shout. Phase: sensory immersion. In the boardroom, only the ticking of an expensive watch on the wrist of one of the shareholders was heard. The light of the lamps was reflected in glass carafes of water, creating cold glints on the faces of those present. Alexei smelled the leather of the chairs and a faint scent of chalk from the board. The smells of old power, which was now changing owners. He felt like steel tempered in ice-cold water. No flexibility, only hardness capable of cutting through any obstacle. Chapter 8. The psychology of the crowd. Isolation and suppression phase. The encounter. The shareholders wavered. They saw Alexei's success but feared Viktor's authority. This was a classic stalemate situation. Alexei understood. He needed to destroy the unity of the group. Gentlemen, he began, addressing not everyone at once, but the weakest of the shareholders, Mr. Kowalski. You surely remember who was the first to propose investing in the logistics hub that is currently bringing losses. It was not Viktor. It was the council that he convinced. Who among you is ready to take personal responsibility for the next failure? Kowalski looked away. Alexei immediately moved his gaze to another. Or perhaps you, Gennady Petrovich? Alexei used the technique of personalization of responsibility. A heavy silence reigned in the hall. Each of them now felt not like part of a powerful council, but like a lonely person facing a financial catastrophe. Viktor tried to interject, but Alexei immediately interrupted him with a question to the audience, not letting him restore his status as the voice of the group. Phase: psychological X-ray. Here, the mechanism of de-individuation is applied in reverse. In a crowd, people are brave because responsibility is diffused, the bystander effect. Alexei methodically pulls each person out of the safe group and places them face to face with a personal threat. He uses the cognitive bias of loss aversion. For shareholders, the fear of losing what they have is much stronger than the desire to earn more. By reminding them of past mistakes under Viktor's leadership, Alexei turns Viktor into a symbol of loss. Terminology. Alexei is conducting social isolation of the leader. He does not attack Viktor's ideas. He attacks Viktor's connection with his followers, forcing the latter to feel that loyalty to Viktor is a direct threat to their own well-being. Phase: counterstrike. I propose a vote. Alexei lowered his voice to a whisper, forcing everyone to lean toward him to hear. But not a general one. Let everyone write their decision on a piece of paper, anonymously. He knew that publicly they might fear Viktor, but left alone with themselves and their fear of loss, they would choose the one who was stronger at the moment. The vote took 5 minutes. Viktor was deposed by 80% of the votes. Lesson number 8. A group is an illusion of strength. Break the group into individuals, press on their personal fears, and the monolith will crumble into dust. Personal gain always defeats corporate loyalty. Phase: sensory immersion. Alexei watched as they wrote on the papers. The rustle of paper reminded him of the rustling of dry leaves under a predator's feet. The air smelled of ozone, a precursor to the storm that had just washed away the old order. He saw Kowalski wiping sweat from his forehead. The city outside the window continued to hum, indifferent to the fact that a reputation murder had just occurred in this office. Chapter 9. The Golden Bridge, the Art of Capitulation Phase. The Encounter. Victor sat in his chair, crushed. His empire had collapsed. He looked at Alexei with the hatred of a man who had nothing left to lose. And that was dangerous. A cornered predator can go on a suicidal attack. Victor still had connections in the tax office and compromising material on the company's old affairs. Alexei approached him and sat opposite, not at the desk, but in an ordinary chair, like an old friend. "Victor," he said softly, "you have lost, but I do not want your blood. I need a peaceful transition of power. You have a house in Spain. You have accounts that I forgot to mention in the report. Retire to an honorable pension. Save face. You will become an honorary advisor with a good salary, but without voting rights." Victor clenched his fists. His ego screamed for revenge. But his brain, poisoned by cortisol and fatigue, feverishly calculated the options. "And if I refuse?" he rasped. "Then tomorrow morning, the folder with your offshore schemes will be on the prosecutor's desk, and I shall personally see to it that they take even that house away from you. Choose. Honorable peace or prison cell." Phase. Psychological X-ray. Alexei applies the ancient strategy of Sun Tzu, the Golden Bridge. Never leave an enemy without an exit. If a person has nothing to lose, they become unpredictable and dangerous. By giving Victor the opportunity to save face and his wealth, Alexei makes him a partner in his victory. Game theory works here. Nash equilibrium. For Victor, capitulation on Alexei's terms is the best of the possible bad outcomes. His rational pragmatism must overcome his anger. Alexei specifically emphasized the honorary status to soften the blow to Victor's ego. This reduces the risk that he will decide to act irrationally. Phase. Counter-strike. Victor remained silent for a long time. He looked at his hands, the hands of an old man who could no longer hold a sword. "Fine," he finally said. "I will sign the resignation papers for health reasons." Alexei nodded. He did not triumph. He simply recorded the result. Lesson number 9. Never finish off a defeated enemy if they can be useful or if their agony can harm you. Give them a path to retreat that looks like an exit, but is actually their final disappearance from your chessboard. Phase. Sensory immersion. The office became unusually quiet. The hum of the city outside the windows seemed like a distant surf. Alexei watched as Victor signed the papers. The pen squeaked on the parchment like claws on stone. The light of the setting sun painted the room a blood-red color. This was the end of an era. Alexei stood up and left without looking back. The smell of old leather and tobacco remained behind. Ahead was the smell of fresh concrete and new opportunities. Chapter 10. Final Mutation, the Psychology of Strength Phase. The Encounter. Alexei stood on the roof of the Argus Holdings skyscraper. Now the entire building belonged to him. He remembered the Alexei who had come here 6 months ago with hope for fair recognition. That person now seemed to him like a stranger, a naive child who would have been eaten in the very first week if he had not met his own predators. A new assistant approached him, a young guy with burning eyes, reminding Alexei of himself in the past. "Alexei Vladimirovich, Elena has arrived. She is asking for a meeting." She says she has new ideas for the project. Alexei looked at the city spread out below. Thousands of ant people were running about their business, believing in the rules that he had just rewritten. "Tell her she has 5 minutes," Alexei replied without turning around. "And warn her, if she starts with emotions, the meeting will end in the first minute." He no longer felt guilt. He did not feel joy. He felt only clarity. Phase, psychological X-ray. This is the stage of full integration of the shadow. Alexei has stopped fighting his aggressive, calculating side and made it leading. His prefrontal cortex now completely dominates over the limbic system. He has gone through a radical transformation of personality. Biologically, his body has adapted to chronic stress, turning it into a working state. His dopamine system now responds not to the approval of others, but to the fact of seizing control. He realized the main truth of human ethology. Hierarchy is not evil. It is nature. And you are either at the top or at the base. No middle path exists for those who want to think strategically. Phase. Counter-strike. Alexei turned to the assistant. "And one more thing. Check Mark's accounts. I want to know what he is spending his severance pay on. If he starts playing against us, I must find out earlier than he decides it himself." "Understood, Alexei Vladimirovich." Alexei was left alone. He took a sip of water, cold, tasteless, and clean, like his new life. Lesson number 10. Strength is not the absence of feelings. It is the ability to put them at the service of a goal. To become a hunter means taking responsibility for your cruelty. Stop being naive. Start thinking strategically. The world belongs to those who dare to look into the abyss and not blink. Phase, sensory immersion. The wind on the roof was sharp and smelled of metal. The sky overhead was a deep black color, and the stars seemed like cold diamonds scattered on velvet. Below, the city pulsated, a huge biomechanical organism living according to the laws of force. Alexei stood on the edge, and the shadow of the skyscraper fell on the streets like a giant finger pointing the way. He was part of this mechanism. He was its brain. Epilogue. The price of absolute autonomy. Phase. The encounter. Narrative. A year later, Alexei stood in that same Argus-holding meeting room where Mark and Victor had once tried to grind him into powder. Everything here was different now. The lighting had become dimmed. The furniture was functionally minimalist, devoid of boastfulness. He looked at the young intern who had just finished a presentation. The intern stood, shifting from foot to foot, waiting for praise. And in his eyes, Alexei saw that very poison that had almost killed him. The hope for recognition. Alexei remained silent for exactly 6 seconds. He saw the pores on the young man's forehead expand, saw how he involuntarily clenched his fists, trying to cope with the rising anxiety. "Your strategy is built on the assumption that people will follow rules," Alexei said. And his voice, devoid of any emotional coloring, seemed part of the ventilation system. "You have prepared a plan for a world that does not exist. You still believe that truth matters." He approached the window. The entire city was visible in the palm of his hand, a giant terrarium. "You are free. Go and rewrite everything based on the fact that every ally of yours tomorrow may become your executioner. And do not expect me to say good. Good is a euphemism for mediocrity." The intern left, almost tripping over the threshold. Alexei felt neither satisfaction nor pity. In his inner world, there was no longer room for these cumbersome, energy-consuming constructs. Phase, psychological X-ray. Analysis. We conclude our cycle with an analysis of the most complex state, the psychology of the summit. Most people mistakenly believe that power brings peace. This is a biological lie. At the top of the hierarchy, the prefrontal cortex works 24/7. Alexei is in a state of hypervigilance. His brain no longer perceives social signals as friendly or hostile. It classifies them only as useful or dangerous. Here, the mechanism of hedonic adaptation to power comes into play. The dopamine response to victory becomes shorter and shorter, requiring ever more complex and large-scale chess games. Alexei is devoid of illusions, but he is also devoid of simple human comfort. His psyche has undergone a final mutation. He can no longer be naive, even if he wanted to. His mirror neurons, responsible for empathy, are suppressed by an effort of will for the sake of the system's survival. Biologically, this state is close to the state of an alpha individual in the wild. This is constant tension in the neck muscles, an increased basal testosterone level, and the absence of a deep relaxation phase. This is the price of absolute autonomy. Phase, counterstrike, the lesson. Alexei sat at the table and opened a blank notebook. He knew that right now, in back rooms or on lower floors, someone like his former self was already sharpening a knife, studying his habits. And this caused in him only a cold respect for the laws of ethology. Lesson number 11, final. Power is not a destination. It is a way of moving along a tightrope over an abyss. As soon as you decide that you have won finally, you will begin to fall. Your only real defense is a constant readiness for the rules to change in a second. Phase, sensory immersion. Sterile silence reigned in the office. Huge windows cut off the roar of the metropolis, turning it into a silent film. The air was perfectly filtered, devoid of the smells of coffee, sweat, or cheap ambitions. Alexei touched the cold surface of the black obsidian table. The stone was ancient, indifferent, and hard. Alexei felt the same. Outside the window, darkness was gathering, and in the reflection of the glass, he saw not a person, but only a contour, a silhouette of strength that fit perfectly into the geometry of the night city. You have read to the end. But remember, knowing the anatomy of a trap does not make you a hunter. It only gives you a chance not to become prey in the very first second. Your naivety is a habit. Start breaking it today, or the world will break you tomorrow.